In a healthy society, staying is supposed to be the neutral choice. You study, you work, you gain experience, you build a life step by step. You may not get rich quickly, you may not move fast, but at the very least you expect this. That effort today makes tomorrow slightly better. Not perfect, not easy, just better. That assumption sits quietly underneath almost every major decision people make. Where to live, what job to take, how much risk to accept, when to delay gratification. It doesn't need to be spoken, it's just there. Time is supposed to be on your side. If you stay, if you try, if you keep going. And even when life isn't great, you feel like you're moving in the right direction. That's what makes staying feel neutral. You're not choosing growth. You're not choosing sacrifice. You're simply choosing continuity. But that assumption only works if effort actually compounds. If staying produces progress, if patience eventually gets rewarded, if the future remains meaningfully better than the present. This analysis is part of a longer observation of how modern systems behave over time. And this is where the story begins to change. Not with a collapse, not with a crisis, not with a single dramatic moment, but with a quiet realization that something no longer lines up. People do what they're supposed to do. They work harder. They gain experience. They stay employed. They stay responsible. Yet year after year, their position doesn't meaningfully improve. They're not falling behind, but they're not moving forward either. Same routines, same stress, same pressure, with slightly higher numbers attached. At first, this doesn't feel alarming. It feels temporary. Maybe it's just timing. Maybe it's a bad cycle. Maybe things will realign. Most people don't panic when progress slows. They assume it will resume, so they wait. They adjust. They compromise a little more. And that's still normal behavior. That's still trust in the system. But over time, the gap between effort and outcome stops closing. Raises don't change lives. They stabilize them. Experience doesn't create leverage. It creates responsibility. Longer hours don't open doors. They maintain position. Nothing is obviously broken, but nothing is improving either. This is the first crack. Not big enough to trigger rebellion. Not painful enough to force exit. Just enough to make progress feel uncertain. And when progress becomes uncertain, staying quietly stops being neutral. Not all at once, not consciously, but something fundamental shifts. Because a system doesn't need to punish people to change their behavior. It only needs to stop rewarding them. And that's the moment most people miss. When progress slows, people don't revolt. They recalculate. They ask reasonable questions. Maybe the expectations were outdated. Maybe the timeline was unrealistic. Maybe this is just what adulthood looks like now. At first, this sounds mature, even responsible, and every system relies on this phase. Because rational people don't abandon structure immediately. They try to make sense of it. So people adjust their language. They stop saying, I'm not moving forward. They start saying, at least I'm stable. They stop asking, why does this feel harder every year? They say, this is just how cities work now. You start hearing new sentences. Renting is basically the same as owning. At least I have a roof. Everyone is dealing with this. You're not supposed to get ahead anymore. These statements aren't delusional. They're defensive. They don't claim the system is good. They claim it's unavoidable. And that distinction matters. Because once a situation is framed as unavoidable, it no longer needs to be evaluated. It only needs to be survived. This is how rationalization begins, not as denial, but as emotional risk management. When effort no longer guarantees improvement, hope becomes expensive. Expectations start to hurt. So people lower them, not because they want less, but because wanting more feels unsafe. The question quietly changes. Not, is this working? But, can I live with this? And when that becomes the benchmark, many bad arrangements suddenly qualify as acceptable. Debt that never shrinks becomes manageable. Housing that absorbs most income becomes normal. Work that maintains position becomes being responsible. None of these stories are lies. They're coping mechanisms. They protect the mind from the stress of contradiction, because living inside a system that no longer rewards effort creates a psychological tension Either the system is broken or your expectations are. And it is far less painful to adjust expectations than to confront the possibility that years of effort were absorbed without return. So people reframe. They say they didn't want those things anyway. They say ambition is overrated. They say security matters more than progress. And slowly, without any policy change, behavior begins to shift. People stop planning long-term. They stop making big moves. They stop taking risks that don't have immediate payoff. Not because they're lazy, not because they're afraid, but because risk no longer feels asymmetric in their favor. Effort still exists, but it starts flowing into maintenance instead of momentum. At this point, the system begins to lock itself in. The cost of deviation rises. The downside of trying something different becomes immediate and personal. The upside becomes distant and uncertain. Leaving a stable position feels risky. Challenging the structure feels expensive. Being early feels dangerous. When everyone else is optimizing for survival, the first person to push for more absorbs the highest risk. This creates a coordination problem. Each individual waits for evidence that the system will reward effort again, but evidence only appears after behavior changes at scale. So waiting becomes the rational choice. Caution reinforces itself, and the system stabilizes around low expectations. Not because alternatives are impossible, but because moving first is punished. This is how stagnation persists. Even when conditions technically improve, the structure remains intact. The incentives remain misaligned, and behavior adapts accordingly. And once that happens, a system doesn't need to suppress dissatisfaction. People do it themselves, quietly. Over time, coping stops feeling temporary. What began as adjustment quietly becomes normal. People stop explaining their choices. They stop justifying them. They stop arguing about them. Because once something feels normal, it no longer feels like a problem. This is where adaptation stops being individual and starts becoming social. At first, people adjust quietly. They change expectations in private. They lower personal standards to reduce stress. But over time, those private adjustments begin to surface in public language. What started as coping turns into shared reasoning. Stability becomes a virtue. Caution becomes maturity. And ambition begins to look irresponsible. Not because ambition disappeared, but because it now threatens social balance. When most people are making compromises, anyone who refuses to do so creates discomfort. Their expectations highlight the gap. Others are trying not to look at. So pressure reverses direction. Instead of asking why conditions are limited, groups begin discouraging those who still expect more. Friends warn each other not to aim too high. Colleagues frame risk as recklessness. Parents teach children to be practical, not as control, but as protection. This is how normalization spreads, not through rules or enforcement, but through repetition and reassurance. Once lowered expectations are shared and reinforced, they stop feeling temporary. They become the baseline. And once a baseline forms, behavior no longer needs justification. This is the moment most people miss. Normalization doesn't announce itself. There's no headline, no sudden collapse. Life keeps moving. People still work. They still pay. They still show up. From the outside, everything looks functional. But inside the decision-making process, something fundamental has shifted. People no longer ask, what would a good life look like? They ask, what can I tolerate? That question quietly lowers the ceiling on everything that follows. Careers stop being about growth. They become about stability. Housing stops being about building a future. It becomes about avoiding displacement. Debt stops being something you eliminate. It becomes something you manage indefinitely. And none of this feels dramatic. It feels adult, responsible. This is why normalization is so dangerous. It disguises loss as maturity. People begin to say things like, that's just how the economy works now. You can't expect things to be easier. This is what being realistic looks like. And once those sentences become common, the system gains something incredibly powerful: silence. Not because people are satisfied, but because dissatisfaction no longer knows where to go. When everyone around you is making the same compromises, those compromises stop feeling optional. They become the baseline. This is how bad conditions turn into social norms, not enforced by law, not demanded by authority, but reinforced by repetition. Friends warn each other not to expect too much. Parents tell children to be practical. Ambition gets reframed as irresponsibility, is not because anyone wants less, but because disappointment has become familiar, and familiarity feels safer than hope. At this stage, the system doesn't need to convince anyone that it works. It only needs people to stop comparing their lives to what they could have been, and that comparison slowly disappears. Not through force, through fatigue. People grow tired of feeling like something is wrong without knowing how to fix it. So they stop naming it, they adapt emotionally, and once that adaptation sets in, pressure vanishes. No urgency, no demand for structural change, no visible crisis, just millions of individuals quietly shrinking their expectations to fit the environment. This is the illusion of stability. A society can look calm while its sense of possibility collapses. And when normalization completes, the system enters its most comfortable phase. Not healthy, comfortable, because nothing is being challenged anymore. But this is not the end of the process. Normalization is not the final state, it's the bridge. Because when people live long enough, inside normalized constraints, something else begins to form. Not anger, not protest, something quieter, and far more dangerous. That's what comes next. Normalization doesn't just change behavior, it changes belief. At first, people accept bad conditions because they feel temporary, and they accept them. Because everyone else has. Eventually, they accept them. Because imagining alternatives starts to feel unrealistic. This is the point where something deeper breaks. People stop asking, how do I get ahead? Not because they're lazy, not because they're hopeless, but because the question no longer feels answerable. When effort repeatedly fails to change outcomes, the brain adapts. It doesn't panic. It conserves energy. It stops projecting forward. This is not apathy, it's learned helplessness. And learned helplessness doesn't look like despair, it looks like calm. People still function, they still work, they still make decisions, but those decisions no longer assume improvement. They assume maintenance. Planning collapses inward. 5-year plans disappear. Long-term ambition fades. Life becomes shorter horizon, rent renewal, next paycheck, next expense. People stop thinking in trajectories and start thinking in cycles, not because they want less, but because believing in more has become emotionally expensive. This is the moment systems do their deepest damage, not by blocking opportunity, but by training people not to expect it. Once that expectation dies, pressure disappears completely. People don't protest because protest assumes responsiveness. People don't leave because leaving feels risky. People don't demand reform because demand assumes the system can change. Instead, they adapt fully. They internalize the limits. And once limits are internalized, the system no longer has to enforce them. This is why learned helplessness is so stable. It runs without coercion. People police themselves. They warn others not to aim too high. They discourage risk. They frame ambition as naive. And the most dangerous part, they feel rational doing it. From the outside, nothing looks broken. GDP still grows. Cities remain busy. Institutions function. But internally, belief has collapsed. A society can survive without optimism, but it cannot progress without belief. That effort changes outcomes. And once belief disappears, even good policies struggle to work because behavior lags belief. People wait to see if improvement is real, sometimes for decades. This is why some systems remain stagnant long after conditions technically improve. The rules change, the psychology didn't. And this is the point where stagnation stops being economic and becomes generational. Children don't inherit poverty. They inherit caution. They don't learn to test systems. They learn to avoid them. They don't imagine futures. They manage risk. Not because they're weak, but because they were taught. That expectation leads to disappointment. And once an entire generation learns that lesson, recovery becomes incredibly hard. Because recovery requires belief before it produces results. And belief is the first thing people lost. Subscribe if you want to continue observing these systems.